Everyone remembers SpongeBob as the safest cartoon ever made. Bright colors, silly laughs, nothing underneath it. Parents trusted it. Networks built empires on it. Researchers, censors, and one anonymous stranger on a message board all looked at the same show and saw something else. In this video, we go through every SpongeBob controversy and the theories behind them. Section 1. The Nuclear Test Site Theory. Bikini Bottom and Bikini Atoll. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, roughly halfway between Hawaii and Papua New Guinea, there is a ring of coral islands that almost nobody in America could point to on a map. It is called Bikini Atoll. The word atoll simply means a ring-shaped reef, or group of islands built up from coral over thousands of years, usually wrapped around a lagoon in the middle. Bikini is the anglicized spelling of Bikini, and the atoll sits inside the Marshall Islands, a scattered chain spread across roughly 1 million square miles of open ocean, just north of the equator. For most of human history, almost nothing happened there that the rest of the world ever heard about. Then the Second World War ended, and everything changed. In the aftermath of the war, the United Nations placed a huge stretch of the northern Pacific under American control, and the Marshall Islands were part of that arrangement. The United States government began looking for somewhere remote enough to test nuclear weapons without endangering large populations, and Bikini fit the description almost perfectly. It was far from anywhere. It had a wide protected lagoon big enough to anchor a fleet of ships inside, and it had very few people living on it. In 1946, the residents of Bikini were removed from their home and relocated to Rongerik, an island to the east. The move was presented as temporary. It never turned out that way. The new island could not support them, food crops failed, and the community that had lived on Bikini for generations ended up dealing with hunger and displacement that stretched across decades. Between 1946 and 1958, the United States detonated 67 nuclear weapons across Bikini and the nearby atoll of Eniwetok. Some were dropped from planes, some were fired from towers, and at least one was detonated underwater inside the lagoon itself, throwing up a column of water and radioactive debris that was photographed from every angle and studied for years afterward. The largest of them all came on March 1, 1954, in a test known as Castle Bravo. It was far more powerful than the scientists running it had predicted, and the fallout spread much further than anyone had planned for. 3 islands were destroyed outright. Radiation drifted across inhabited areas nearby. People living downwind experienced burns, sickness, and long-term health problems that continued for the rest of their lives and affected their children after them. To this day, March 1 is marked in the Marshall Islands as a day of remembrance, with students gathering every year to acknowledge what happened to their grandparents and great-grandparents. The atoll itself has never been made safe. Soil contamination in the growing areas remained high enough that returning permanently was judged unwise, and the descendants of the original population are still scattered across other islands and other countries. The lagoon has become an unlikely diving destination, drawing visitors to the sunken warships resting on the bottom, which is a strange second life for a place that was emptied of its people so those ships could be destroyed. That is the real history sitting underneath one of the most popular children's cartoons ever made. Bikini Bottom, the underwater town where a yellow sea sponge flips burgers and annoys his neighbor, shares its name with the place where all of that took place. For years, that overlap sat quietly in the background, noticed mostly by people who happened to know both stories. Then the internet got hold of it. The theory in its modern form traces back to a post on Reddit, where a user pointed out something that seems obvious once someone says it out loud. Bikini Bottom is called Bikini Bottom because it sits at the bottom of Bikini Atoll. And if a town sits directly underneath a location where dozens of nuclear weapons were detonated over the course of 12 years, then the sea creatures living in that town would have been swimming through decades of radioactive water. According to the theory, that exposure explains every strange thing about the show. It explains why a sponge can talk, hold a job, wear clothing, and drive a boat. It explains why a starfish can carry on a conversation. It explains why an octopus plays a clarinet and lives in a stone head, why a crab runs a restaurant with a cash register, and why a single-celled organism has built a functioning robot wife and a laboratory full of machinery. None of these creatures behave like anything found in a real ocean. Under the theory, that is exactly the point. Under the theory, They are what normal sea life turned into after being soaked in fallout for a generation. Fans built the theory out further from there, and some of the details they found are hard to wave away. Sandy Cheeks, the squirrel who lives underwater inside a glass dome and wears a diving suit whenever she steps outside, became one of the strongest pieces of supposed evidence. Land animals were kept aboard Navy vessels during the testing period, held there so scientists could measure what radiation exposure did to living creatures. A rodent from dry land, ending up in the middle of a nuclear test site, is close to what actually happened. Other fans pointed at the explosions in the show itself, noting that whenever something blows up in Bikini Bottom, the animation tends to draw the blast as a rising column with a spreading cloud on top, which is the exact silhouette of a nuclear detonation rather than a normal cartoon fireball. Others pointed at the visual style of the town, which leans heavily on 1950s design, tiki decoration, diner architecture, and a general sense of post-war Americana that lines up neatly with the years the tests were running. Even the opening of the show got pulled into the argument. The theme song sequence includes a shot of an island, and fans have long claimed that the island is a direct reference to the atoll the town is named after. There is one more piece of the theory that gets less attention than it deserves, and it concerns the show's own internal logic. Bikini Bottom is not presented as a place cut off from the human world. Across the films and several episodes, the characters travel to the surface, interact with people, and are treated by those people as unusual but not impossible. Boats sink into the town. Objects from above fall through the water and are used as furniture. Human tourists occasionally appear. That relationship between the two worlds is one of the reasons the nuclear reading gained traction, because it offers an explanation for why the surface world seems generally unbothered by a talking sponge. Under the theory, humans already know what happened in that particular stretch of ocean, which makes the presence of intelligent sea life strange but not shocking. The obvious objection is that a cartoon with almost no interest in continuity is a poor place to look for consistent world building. The show has contradicted itself constantly across more than 2 decades, changing the geography of the town, the ages of the characters, and the basic rules of what is possible underwater whenever a joke required it. Fans building a coherent theory out of that material are effectively assembling a picture from pieces that were never cut to fit together. Which does not make the exercise pointless, but it does mean any conclusion drawn from it is standing on very soft ground. The theory also collects smaller details that supporters treat as confirmation and skeptics treat as noise. The show's music leans heavily on Hawaiian steel guitar and mid-century lounge arrangements, which places it sonically in exactly the era of the tests. The town's architecture mixes tiki carvings, anchors, and other Pacific Island motifs that were fashionable in American design during the same decades, a style that grew directly out of servicemen returning from that region after the war. Even the recurring visual of a wooden tiki head, used across the series as a building and a landmark, ties back to a design trend that exists because of American military presence in the Pacific. None of that proves intent. All of it means the show is dressed in the visual language of the exact period and place the theory is pointing at, which is why the connection keeps feeling stronger than the evidence justifies. Against all of that sits the actual biography of the man who made the show, which points in a very different direction. Steven Hillenburg was a marine biologist before he was an animator. He studied marine resource planning, and he spent years working at the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, California, teaching visiting schoolchildren about tide pools and the creatures living inside them. To help with that teaching, he created a small illustrated comic about intertidal life, guided by a talking sponge character. That comic was the seed of everything that came later. Hillenburg then went back to school for animation, worked on another Nickelodeon cartoon as a director and writer, and eventually pitched the idea that became the show. His interest was never politics or weapons testing. It was tide pools, sea life, and jokes. There is also no direct evidence that Hillenburg ever said he intended Bikini Bottom to be a fallout zone. When people who study the show carefully look for a clear statement from him confirming the theory, they do not find one. The most honest answer is that the name Bikini Atoll is a real place name attached to a real underwater location, and a marine biologist naming an underwater town would reach for a real underwater place name without necessarily loading it with meaning. That reading is boring, and it is also entirely plausible. What keeps the theory alive is that the people who worked on the show have not exactly rushed to knock it down either. Doug Lawrence, known professionally as Mr. Lawrence, has been part of the series since the beginning, as both a writer and the voice of Plankton. In an interview years later, he spoke about the nuclear test site idea as something the team enjoyed rather than something they wanted to correct, describing the fun of pushing the concept and seeing how far it could go. He also added his own extra layer to it, suggesting a version of events in which the surface world is simply gone and Bikini Bottom is what remains. That addition does not actually line up with the rest of the franchise, since the movies show human beings alive and functioning above the water, and characters travel between the two worlds without anyone treating it as impossible. Fans noticed the contradiction immediately, which is a good reminder that a comment from one member of a writing staff is not the same thing as canon. The theory has one more layer that has nothing to do with mutation or fallout, and it is the layer that has aged the most uncomfortably. Museums and educators working with Marshallese communities have pointed out that an enormous number of Americans can instantly name Bikini Bottom and describe who lives there, while almost none of those same people can say anything at all about the real Bikini Atoll or the families who were removed from it. A cartoon has effectively taken over the name. When a class of students is asked what bikini makes them think of, the answer that comes back is a sponge in square pants, not a displaced population or a day of remembrance. That part is measurable rather than speculative, and it has become one of the more serious threads inside what otherwise looks like an internet game. Educators working on this subject have made a practical suggestion rather than an accusatory one, which is that the name recognition could be used rather than resented. A generation that already knows the word bikini has a hook available that no textbook can provide, and a small number of teachers have built lessons around exactly that, using the cartoon as the way into a conversation about the Marshall Islands. That is probably the most useful thing anyone has done with the theory. None of this means the show set out to erase anything. There is no indication the production ever positioned itself as a statement about nuclear weapons or as an argument for restitution for the people of the Marshall Islands. The people who make the show make comedy, and they have generally treated the whole conversation as an interesting coincidence rather than a hidden message. But the coincidence is real, the timeline is real, and the name is real, which is why this particular theory refuses to die no matter how many times someone points out how thin the evidence is. What makes it the strongest of all the SpongeBob theories is that it does not require anything supernatural or absurd to hold together. Every other big theory about the show asks the audience to believe in hidden symbolism or secret messages. This one only asks the audience to look at a map, look at a calendar, and notice that a bright yellow children's cartoon named its town after the most heavily bombed piece of ocean floor in human history. It is worth walking through the man's actual background, because it is the single most useful piece of evidence in either direction. Stephen Hillenburg grew up interested in the ocean and studied marine resource planning at Humboldt State University in Northern California. He did not go to art school first. He went into marine science, and then he took a job at the Ocean Institute in Dana Point, teaching visiting school groups about the creatures that live in tide pools. That job is the reason the show exists. Tide pools are shallow, they are full of bizarre-looking animals, and they are the easiest place on Earth to show a child something strange without leaving the beach. Hillenburg spent his days explaining crabs, starfish, sea snails, and sponges to 9-year-olds, and he built an illustrated comic to help him do it, guided by a talking sponge character. Every single main character in the show can be traced back to something he was teaching about in those years. Only after that did he move into animation, studying at a California art school and working his way into television as a director and writer on another Nickelodeon series. When he pitched his own show, he pitched it in a Hawaiian shirt with an aquarium, which is a detail that has been repeated so many times it has become part of the legend. Nothing in that history suggests a man building a hidden argument about weapons testing into a children's program. It suggests a man who loved sea creatures and wanted a way to make jokes about them. That is why the most careful version of the argument stays modest. It claims something small and hard to dispute, which is that a marine biologist naming an underwater town would know exactly what Bikini Atoll was, because everyone who studies the Pacific knows what Bikini Atoll was. Choosing that name is not the same as building a message around it, but it is also not the same as picking a word at random. Somebody, at some point, looked at a real underwater location, associated with one of the darkest episodes in 20th century science, and decided it would make a good name for a comedy. There is a second real-world detail that fans bring up often. The lagoon still holds the sunken remains of the warships that were anchored there as targets, including a full-sized aircraft carrier resting on the seabed, and photographs of those wrecks look uncannily like the half-buried machinery scattered around the town in the show. Anchors, portholes, and rusted hulls are part of the standard scenery in Bikini Bottom, used as houses, furniture, and landmarks. In the show, they read as ocean-themed set dressing. In the real lagoon, they are the leftovers of a weapons test. The other reason the theory has staying power is the visual record. The underwater detonation carried out in the lagoon in 1946 produced photographs that are among the most reproduced images of the entire nuclear era, showing an enormous white column of water rising out of the sea with a spreading cap of vapor on top and ships silhouetted against it. Anyone who has seen those photographs and then watched an explosion happen in Bikini Bottom will notice the resemblance. Whether that resemblance is deliberate reference or simply the standard way animators have drawn big explosions since the middle of the last century is impossible to prove either way, which is precisely the condition every good conspiracy theory needs in order to survive. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fallout is not the only framework fans have bolted onto Bikini Bottom. Another theory skips science entirely and reaches for a list written centuries before anyone built a bomb, claiming every main character was handed a role before the first episode aired. Section 2. The 7 Deadly Sins Theory. Long before anyone was making cartoons, religious writers in Europe put together a list meant to describe the roots of human failure. 7 behaviors, 7 weaknesses, 7 ways a person goes wrong: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. The list has been rewritten, reordered, and argued over for well over 1,000 years, and it has shown up in paintings, poems, novels, horror films, and video games ever since. Somewhere along the way, a group of people on the internet decided it had also shown up in a Nickelodeon cartoon about a talking sponge. The theory works on a simple premise. The show has a small core cast of characters who appear in nearly every episode, and each of those characters is built around one dominant personality trait that never changes no matter how many seasons pass. Line those traits up next to the old list, and the fit looks uncomfortably neat. Once someone sees the pattern, it becomes very hard to unsee, which is exactly why this theory has spread further than almost any other idea attached to the show. The cleanest match, and the one nobody argues about, is Mr. Krabs and greed. His entire character is money. He owns the Krusty Krab, he pays SpongeBob almost nothing, and he treats every single dollar as if it were a member of his family. Across the run of the series, he has faked injuries for insurance payouts, sold food that should never have been served, charged his own employees for things they should have received for free, refused to spend money on basic maintenance, and repeatedly put people in danger rather than accept a small financial loss. There are entire episodes built around the idea that Mr. Krabs would rather lose a friend than lose a coin. He is not greedy as a background quirk. Greed is the engine that drives most of the plots he appears in, and the writers have leaned into it harder as the series has gone on. If the theory only had this one character to point at, it would already have a foothold. Squidward gets assigned wrath, and the case for him is almost as strong. He spends most of his screen time furious. He is angry at his neighbors, angry at his job, angry at customers, angry at the world for failing to recognize his talent. His anger runs as a long, slow, permanent irritation rather than the loud, explosive kind that burns out quickly, and it colors everything he does. He plays the clarinet badly and blames everyone else for not appreciating it. He paints self-portraits and resents that nobody else values them. He has no interest in improving his situation, only in complaining about it. Some versions of the theory swap him over to pride instead, arguing that his real defining trait is an inflated sense of his own artistic ability rather than rage. Both readings work, which fans usually treat as a sign that the theory is flexible rather than a sign that it is unfalsifiable. Patrick Star takes sloth, and this is the assignment that requires the least explanation. He lives under a rock. He sleeps constantly. He has no job, no ambitions, and no interest in developing either. Entire episodes have been built around Patrick doing nothing at all and treating it as an achievement. When he does take action, it is usually because SpongeBob dragged him into something. There is a well-known moment in the series where Patrick's greatest accomplishment is presented as a total absence of effort, and fans point at scenes like that as the clearest confirmation the theory could ask for. Plankton gets envy, and the fit is structural rather than incidental. His entire existence is defined by wanting what someone else has. He runs a failing restaurant directly across the street from a successful one, and every scheme he has ever attempted has been aimed at stealing the Krabby Patty formula. He does not want to invent something better. He wants what Mr. Krabs already owns. Even his relationship with Karen, his computer wife, is shaped by his obsession with a rival's success, rather than by anything happening inside his own life. He has been offered chances to walk away, and he never takes them. Envy is not something Plankton feels occasionally. Envy is the reason the character exists at all. Gary, SpongeBob's pet snail, is assigned gluttony, and the reasoning here is thinner but consistent. Gary is preoccupied with food. Several episodes revolve around him being overfed, underfed, or driven to extremes by the promise of a meal. There is a stretch of the series where a storyline is built entirely around Gary eating more than he should, and the consequences that follow. Fans who support the theory argue that a pet defined almost entirely by appetite is exactly what gluttony would look like if you had to draw it as a cartoon snail. Sandy Cheeks gets pride, and this one splits the fandom. On one side, the argument is that Sandy is constantly demonstrating her superiority. She is the scientist, the athlete, the karate expert, and the only character who regularly reminds everyone that where she comes from, things are done better. She competes when nobody asked her to compete. She corrects people. She takes personal offense when her homeland or her abilities are questioned. On the other side, fans point out that Sandy is also generous, loyal, and helpful, and that confidence in your own skills is not the same thing as a moral failing. This is the assignment that gets rewritten the most often when people retell the theory. That leaves SpongeBob himself, and this is where the whole thing starts to wobble. The most commonly repeated version of the theory hands him lust, on the grounds that lust in its oldest sense means overwhelming desire, rather than anything specifically romantic, and SpongeBob desperately wants attention, approval, and friendship at all times. He chases affection from Squidward, who does not want it. He chases praise from Mr. Krabs, who exploits it. He wants to be loved by everyone in Bikini Bottom simultaneously, and falls apart when he is not. Under that reading, his hunger for approval is the same kind of bottomless craving the original list was describing, just aimed at a different target. The problem is that this reading requires a lot of stretching, and plenty of people who otherwise enjoy the theory refuse to accept it. An alternative version says SpongeBob is not a sin at all. In that telling, he is the ordinary soul surrounded by temptations, the one character in the cast who keeps choosing kindness while everyone around him represents a different way to fail. That version is more satisfying as a story, but it also quietly breaks the neat one-to-one structure that made the theory appealing in the first place. Once you allow one character to sit outside the pattern stops being evidence and starts being a coincidence with a good publicist. There is also a version of the theory that inverts the whole thing, arguing that the show is not depicting 7 failings, but demonstrating how people survive alongside them. In that reading, the point of the series is that a town full of deeply flawed individuals continues functioning anyway, held together by one character who refuses to give up on any of them. That version has the advantage of describing what actually happens in most episodes, since the standard structure involves somebody behaving badly and the situation resolving without anyone being punished or reformed. It also has the disadvantage of being far less fun to post online than a neat list of 7 names. The origin of the theory is harder to pin down than the theory itself. It's circulated on forums, image boards, and blogging platforms for years, resurfacing every time a new generation discovered the show, and it has been posted and reposted so many times that tracking down a single original author is effectively impossible. It also benefits from the fact that nobody has to defend it. There is no committee, no author to hold responsible, and no version considered authoritative, which means every objection can be answered by pointing at a different arrangement of the same idea. It travels well because it takes almost no effort to explain. 7 main characters, 7 sins, done. It fits inside a single image, which meant it spread across social media faster than any theory that needed paragraphs of setup. It also belongs to a much larger tradition. The same trick has been performed on almost every beloved children's property in existence. There is a famous version applied to a group of storybook animals in a forest, assigning each one a different mental health condition. There are versions applied to fairy tales, to superhero teams, and to talking train characters. The formula is always the same. Take something warm and simple that adults remember from childhood, place a dark adult framework on top of it, and let the contrast do the work. The theory does not have to be true to be enjoyable, it only has to be surprising. One more thing to look at is how the theory behaves when someone tries to test it against the actual episodes. If each character really stood for one fixed moral failing, you would expect that failing to be the source of the trouble in every story they lead. That is not what happens. Squidward regularly drives episodes through loneliness, insecurity, or a genuine desire to be taken seriously as an artist, none of which are anger. Sandy drives episodes through homesickness and curiosity. Patrick drives episodes through affection for his best friend, which is about the least slothful motivation available. The characters are considerably more flexible than the theory requires, and the writing staff have used that flexibility constantly, because a character who can only ever express one trait becomes useless to a comedy writer very quickly. Which brings the whole thing back to the question of whether anyone involved in making the show ever intended it. There is no statement from Steven Hillenburg confirming that he built his cast around a medieval list of moral failings. Everything known about how the characters came together points somewhere else entirely. Hillenburg was a marine biologist first, and the original versions of these characters grew out of an educational comic about tide pool creatures, where the point was to teach children what actually lives in shallow water. The cast expanded from there using standard comedy construction, which is to say, each character was given one strong, simple trait so that jokes could bounce off them reliably. A cheap boss, a bitter neighbor, a lazy best friend, a jealous rival, and an endlessly enthusiastic lead is a workable comedy setup that has been used in television for decades, without anyone reaching for scripture. That is probably the honest explanation. When you build a cast by giving every character one exaggerated flaw, and the list of human flaws available to you is not very long, some overlap with an ancient catalog of human flaws becomes close to inevitable. The theory is spotting something ordinary, which is that both the cartoon and the old list describe the same handful of ways people behave badly. There is also a counting problem that supporters tend to skip past quickly. The theory needs exactly 7 characters, and the show has considerably more than 7 regulars. Mrs. Puff has appeared in hundreds of episodes and has a fully developed personality built around anxiety and barely contained resentment. Pearl has her own storylines. Karen, Plankton's computer wife, has more screen time than Gary does in most seasons. Larry the Lobster, the Flying Dutchman, and Mermaid Man have all been used repeatedly. To make the theory work, someone has to decide in advance which 7 characters count and which do not, and that decision is being made after the fact by whoever is telling the story. Once you accept that the list is being curated to fit the answer, the tidiness stops being impressive. The variants that circulate reflect that flexibility. In some tellings, Squidward is pride and Sandy is wrath, on the grounds that Sandy is the one who actually gets into physical fights. In others, Mrs. Puff is swapped in for wrath, and Squidward is moved to envy, since a large amount of his misery comes from resenting other people's success. There are versions where Gary is dropped entirely because a snail is not a person, and versions where Patrick doubles up as both sloth and gluttony, given how much of his screen time involves eating. A theory that can be rearranged this freely and still feel convincing is really describing how easy it is to match 7 broad human failings onto 7 exaggerated comedy characters. The comparison that makes this clearest is the one about the storybook bear. There is a famous version of the same trick in which each animal in a 100-acre wood is assigned a psychiatric diagnosis, with the gloomy donkey representing depression, the anxious pig representing an anxiety disorder, and the honey-obsessed bear representing something compulsive. That reading has been repeated so often that many people believe it was intentional. It was not. It came from a light-hearted article published in a medical journal that was written as a joke and then escaped into the world as fact. The 7 deadly sins theory has followed almost exactly the same path, minus the original joke. Even so, the theory has done something interesting to the way people watch the show. Fans who grew up on it as children come back to it as adults and find that the characters really are much darker than they remembered. Mr. Krabs does terrible things. Squidward is miserable, in a way that stops being funny if you think about it too long. Plankton has organized his entire life around resentment. The 7 deadly sins theory may not be true, but it points at something that is, which is that this cartoon has always been built out of deeply flawed people behaving badly, and the bright colors were doing a lot of work to hide it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Fan theories can run forever, because nobody has to answer them. The next controversy was different. It reached a banquet hall in Washington, and 61,000 American schools, and it forced the show's creator to publicly explain what his characters were. Section 3. The Sexuality Controversy, We Are Family, and James Dobson. The trouble started quietly, and it did not start with an activist group or a politician. It started with a business newspaper. In 2002, the Wall Street Journal ran a piece noting that SpongeBob SquarePants had become unusually popular among gay adult viewers, and that merchandise featuring the character was selling well in places nobody at Nickelodeon had been targeting. The article was reporting a market observation, the kind of thing a business paper writes about all the time, with no accusation attached to it. But once that observation existed in print, it took on a life of its own, and it is generally treated as the moment SpongeBob was first publicly linked to a conversation about sexuality. Steven Hillenburg was asked about it directly, and his answer set the tone for everything that followed. He said he had never intended the character to be gay, and that when he thought about his cast, he thought of them as being roughly asexual, meaning the question simply did not apply to them in the world of the show. He also said something that would be quoted back at him for the next 20 years, which was that the attitude of the show was about tolerance. He was not making a political statement. He was describing a cartoon where a sponge, a starfish, a squirrel, an octopus, and a crab all live in the same town without anyone treating the differences between them as a problem. For a couple of years, that was more or less where things sat. It was an odd little media story that got mentioned occasionally and then dropped. What turned it into a national argument was a music video. The song was We Are Family, written by Nile Rodgers and originally recorded by Sister Sledge in 1979. Rodgers had founded a non-profit organization named after the song, and in the early 2000s that foundation put together a video project intended for elementary schools. The concept was straightforward, and on paper, almost impossible to object to. Around 100 well-known children's characters from across different networks and studios would appear together, singing the song, as a message about community and getting along. Characters from competing companies, who would normally never share a screen, were all included, which by itself was a small miracle of licensing. SpongeBob was one of them. The distribution plan was ambitious. The video was set to go out to roughly 61,000 elementary schools across the United States, packaged with teaching materials designed to help educators talk to children about differences and acceptance. The Anti-Defamation League partnered on the project. FedEx agreed to cover the shipping costs for free. A broadcast premiere was scheduled for March 11th, with the video set to air across Nickelodeon, PBS, and the Disney Channel on the same day. Everything about it was built to be uncontroversial. The objection, when it came, was not actually aimed at the video's content. The video never mentions homosexuality at any point. Nobody in it says anything about sexuality at all. They sing a disco song. The objection was aimed at the Foundation's website, which carried a pledge encouraging tolerance across a list of categories, including race, religion, ability, culture, and sexual identity. That last item was the flashpoint. In January 2005, during the week of the presidential inauguration, James Dobson spoke at a black-tie banquet in Washington, attended by roughly 350 guests, hosted jointly by the Family Research Council, Focus on the Family, and American Values. Dobson was the founder of Focus on the Family, and one of the most influential conservative Christian figures in the country at the time. Near the end of his remarks, he raised a concern about the video that was about to go out to schools, arguing that the inclusion of a reference to sexual identity inside a tolerance pledge crossed a line he was not willing to accept. Around the same period, the American Family Association had already published an article by one of its editors making a similar argument, claiming that beneath the surface of a project about cultural differences, one of the differences being celebrated was homosexuality. The reaction was immediate and enormous, and it was not the reaction anyone in that banquet hall expected. Within days, the story had been compressed by the media into a single sentence that was much simpler and much funnier than what had actually been said. That sentence was that a prominent religious leader had accused SpongeBob SquarePants of being gay. Newspapers ran with it. Late-night hosts ran with it. It became one of the biggest entertainment stories of that January, and the tone of nearly all of it was mockery. Journalists pointed out that SpongeBob holds hands with Patrick, that he watches an imaginary superhero show about two elderly men in tights, and that if these things counted as evidence, then almost every cartoon ever made was guilty. Online, the story spread through political forums and blogs at a speed that was still relatively new in 2005. Discussion threads ran for hundreds of comments across sites on both sides of the political divide. Even some Christian commentators publicly argued that whatever the underlying point had been, going after a beloved cartoon Sponge was a catastrophic public relations decision. Dobson pushed back hard against the way he had been characterized. He appeared on cable news to say he had been misquoted and maligned, and he stated plainly that he had never said the character was gay and had never claimed anything of the sort. He explained his position again in his organization's monthly newsletter, walking through the sequence of events at the banquet and stressing that his concern had always been about the tolerance pledge and the teaching materials, rather than about the sponge. From his perspective, the media had taken a specific objection about curriculum and turned it into a cartoon punchline that was easier to laugh at than to argue with. The people behind the video responded from the opposite direction. Nile Rodgers defended the project as an effort to encourage American children to accept individuality, and pointed out that nothing in the video touched on the subject at all. The foundation stood by its pledge. The Anti-Defamation League stood by its involvement. The video went out as planned. Stephen Hillenburg was pulled back into it too, and he said essentially the same thing he had said 3 years earlier, only more firmly. He stated that the controversy had nothing to do with what the show was trying to do, that the characters had never been written as gay, that he considered them close to asexual, and that the whole team was simply trying to be funny. He wanted it understood that whatever the argument was about, it was not about anything that had ever been in a script. The timing of the whole episode matters, because it did not happen in isolation. Earlier that same year, the United States Secretary of Education had publicly criticized an episode of a different children's program, a spin-off of an animated series about an aardvark, before that episode ever aired, effectively keeping it off the air across most of the country. Children's television had become a live front in a much larger cultural argument, and SpongeBob walked into the middle of it, holding a starfish's hand. What makes the story more than a historical curiosity is that it never fully ended. The association stuck, and it kept resurfacing at intervals for years afterward. Every so often a commentator somewhere would revive the claim, or a news outlet would run a retrospective, and the same arguments would start again with slightly different participants. The most significant flare-up came in June 2020, when Nickelodeon posted a message during Pride Month that included SpongeBob among a small group of characters presented in a celebratory context. The post did not explain itself. It did not state that the character was gay, and it did not state that he was not. It simply placed him alongside others, in a way that a very large number of people read as a statement, and the internet did what the internet does. Within hours, the story was everywhere again, split between people treating it as long overdue confirmation and people insisting the network had said nothing of the kind. Nickelodeon never followed up with a clarification, which meant the ambiguity stayed exactly where it was. The commercial dimension deserves a mention too, because it explains a great deal about why the company behaves the way it does. Merchandise built around this character sells across an unusually wide range of demographics, from toddlers to adults buying ironic clothing, and a franchise with that spread has strong reasons to avoid taking a firm position on anything contested. Ambiguity is the commercially safest choice available here, because a definitive answer in either direction would alienate a section of a very large and very profitable audience. Fans on all sides then went back to the same pieces of evidence that had been argued over since 2002. The holding hands, the bubble blowing, the general softness of the character. The fact that SpongeBob has been shown having crushes and going on dates in various episodes. The fact that Hillenburg described his characters as asexual, which some readers took as a straightforward statement that they have no sexuality, and others took as a description that has its own meaning within conversations about identity. None of these arguments has ever produced a conclusion, because the material does not support one. 2 decades on, the most striking thing about the whole business is how little the participants actually disagreed about the facts. Everyone accepted the video contained no reference to the subject. Everyone accepted the creator had never written the character that way. The argument was entirely about what a pledge on a website implied, and it produced weeks of national coverage anyway. What the entire saga really demonstrates is how little the actual show ever had to do with the argument happening around it. At no point did any episode make a claim about any character's sexuality. At no point did the writing staff set out to say anything on the subject. The character was a blank enough surface that different groups of adults could project completely opposite meanings onto him, and then argue with each other about a projection, while the cartoon itself carried on making jokes about fry cooking. The 2005 news cycle is also a useful snapshot of how media worked at that specific moment. The remarks were made at a private banquet in front of a few hundred people. There was no live broadcast and no press release. The story escaped because attendees talked about it, because a conservative discussion forum posted about the upcoming distribution of the video and generated hundreds of comments, and because political blogs on both sides picked it up within days and turned it into the argument of the week. That sequence is completely routine now. In January 2005, it was still relatively new, and the speed of it appears to have caught everyone involved off guard, including the people who had made the remarks in the first place. It is also worth being precise about what the video actually was, because almost every retelling gets it wrong. It was around 100 children's characters from competing companies singing a disco song about getting along, packaged with lesson materials about respecting differences. Sexuality never comes up in it at any point. The entire dispute rested on one word inside a pledge hosted on a website that most of the children receiving the video would never visit. That is a tiny point of disagreement, and compressing it into a claim about a cartoon character's sexuality was a distortion, which is exactly what the people who made the original remarks spent the following weeks arguing, none of which changed the outcome, because by the time anyone was making that argument, the story had already been rewritten by everyone repeating it. That is the part of the episode that has aged most instructively. A specific, technical objection to curriculum materials became a sentence about a cartoon sponge, and the sentence about the sponge is the only part anyone remembers 20 years later. The 2020 flare-up worked the same way, only faster. A single post from a network account, containing no statement of any kind, was read within hours as a definitive announcement by millions of people, and as no announcement at all by millions of others. Both readings spread simultaneously. News outlets covered the reaction rather than the post, because there was nothing in the post to cover, and Nickelodeon, having learned from 15 years of practice, said nothing further and let the argument run itself out. There is a further detail that gets left out of most retellings, which is how the character became popular with adult gay audiences in the first place. Nobody at the network engineered it. The show arrived in 1999 with a lead character who was relentlessly enthusiastic, physically expressive, entirely unbothered by whether other people found him ridiculous, and completely uninterested in performing any conventional version of masculinity. He is delighted by things. He cries easily. He cares intensely about a job most people would find humiliating. Audiences who had spent their lives being told those traits were embarrassing found a character who treated them as strengths, and they responded to it. That is a straightforward explanation, and it requires no hidden intent from anyone. It also demonstrated something about the show's reach. There are not many pieces of children's entertainment that can generate a national news cycle simply by appearing in a video about being nice to people. By 2005, SpongeBob had become common property in a way that very few characters ever manage, recognized by essentially everyone, owned emotionally by essentially everyone, and therefore worth fighting over. The fight was never really about a sponge. The sponge was just the most visible thing in the room, which made him the easiest thing to point at. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Arguing over what a cartoon might secretly mean is one kind of trouble. The next controversy came from something the show did on purpose, on screen, in an episode that taught two of its main characters a word nobody watching was ever allowed to hear. Section 4, the swearing episode, Sailor Mouth and the Dolphin Noise. On September 21, 2001, Nickelodeon aired the 38th episode of SpongeBob SquarePants. It was the first segment of the 18th episode of the second season, and it carried the title Sailor Mouth. It was written by Walt Dorn, Paul Tibbitt, and Meriwether Williams, with Dorn and Tibbitt also handling storyboard duties and Andrew Overtomb directing the animation. On paper, it was a completely ordinary production credit list for that period of the show. What went out over the air was one of the most argued about 11 minutes in the history of children's television. The setup is simple enough that a child can follow it. SpongeBob is taking out the trash behind the Krusty Krab when he notices graffiti scrawled across the dumpster. Most of it is harmless nonsense. One line reads that Mr. Krabs is a certain word, and that word is replaced on the soundtrack by a chirping dolphin noise. SpongeBob has no idea what it means. He reads it out loud in front of a nearby garbage collector, who reacts with open disgust, which only confuses him further. He takes it to Patrick, and Patrick, with total confidence and zero knowledge, explains that it is what people call a sentence enhancer, something you sprinkle into conversation when you want to sound fancy and refined. From there, the episode does exactly what you would expect two children to do, with a word they do not understand. They start using it everywhere. They use it on customers. They use it on each other. They use it in front of the entire restaurant. The reaction they get is uniformly horrified, and they keep going anyway, because they still have no concept of what they are actually saying. Eventually, Mr. Krabs sits them down and explains that the word is one of 13 words that must never be spoken, and that they are now forbidden from saying any of them. The episode then does the thing that made it funny, rather than simply cheeky, which is turn the lesson back on the adult teaching it. Mr. Krabs hurts his foot on a rock and unleashes every single one of the 13 forbidden words in one long, uninterrupted burst. SpongeBob and Patrick are delighted. The three of them end up at the house of Mr. Krabs' mother, who opens her front door to find her grown son and his two employees swearing in unison, and faints on the spot. She announces that they will not be talking like sailors under her roof, and puts all three of them to work painting her house as punishment. Then she hurts her own foot-fetching lemonade, appears to let one slip herself, and the joke lands with a final twist when it turns out the noise was actually the horn of an old man's car. The whole thing runs on sound design. Every single instance of an implied curse is covered by an exaggerated marine or mechanical noise. Dolphin chirps, seal barks, foghorns, and steam locomotive whistles in several variations. The cumulative effect is that the audience hears something like 57 separate censored words across a single 11-minute segment, and every one of them is funny because the replacement noise is ridiculous. The dolphin chirp itself has an oddly specific history. It is not a real dolphin. The sound comes from a stock effects library, and the underlying recording is a sped-up call from a kookaburra, an Australian bird, originally used in a film from 1963 about a dolphin. That recording had been sitting in commercial sound libraries since the early 1990s, waiting for somebody to find the perfect use for it. The reason it exists in the episode at all comes down to a fight the production had internally before a single frame was drawn. Steven Hillenburg described the process years later, recalling that when he pitched the idea of SpongeBob and Patrick learning a swear word, the answer from everyone above him was no. He was not permitted to use a standard broadcast bleep either, because a bleep would have made it unmistakably clear that a real profanity was being represented. So he went looking for a workaround, and the workaround was to bury the words under animal noises. The compromise turned out to be far better than the original idea. A bleep is a censor. A dolphin is a joke. Tom Kenny, the voice of SpongeBob, has talked about how the recording sessions actually worked. The cast did not simply pause where the words would go. They improvised fake profanities out loud, filling the gaps with invented nonsense that would be covered up later in post-production. Kenny has said he was laughing so hard during those sessions that he ended up recording lines while lying on the floor of the sound booth. That detail explains a lot about the energy of the final performance, because the delivery does not sound like actors reading around a hole. It sounds like people having a very good time. Not everything they came up with survived. According to commentary recorded for the Season 2 home release, There was a planned exchange during the board game sequence, in which SpongeBob tells Patrick to go do something to himself, and Patrick tells him the same thing right back, with both instructions covered by dolphin noises. It was cut during the final check on the grounds that it went too far for the audience. The uncut version has never been released, which has turned it into a small piece of lost media that fans have chased for years. A clip supposedly showing an uncensored line circulated online at one point, and was eventually traced back to a fan edit rather than anything from the production. The backlash arrived from the direction you would expect. The Parents Television Council, a media watchdog group that spent the early 2000s cataloging content it considered inappropriate for children, singled the episode out in a published report on children's programming. Their argument was not that the words were audible, because they were not. Their argument was that the episode taught the concept of profanity, walked children through the experience of learning and using a forbidden word, and then made the whole process sound hilarious by covering it with silly noises. In their reading, making swearing funny was more dangerous than making it audible, because a child who finds something funny wants to repeat it. The episode also ended up in a broader report about content aimed at young viewers, where it was used as an example of standards slipping across the industry. The summary of the plot in that report is essentially accurate. Two characters learn a bad word, are told it is a sentence enhancer, spend the episode using it, learn their lesson, and then immediately report an adult for using 13 worse ones. It is also worth appreciating the sheer density of what the episode pulls off inside 11 minutes. The censored words appear something in the region of 57 times across the segment, which works out to roughly 1 every 12 seconds, and the sound design varies constantly, so that no two censored moments land identically. Dolphin chirps give way to foghorns to seal barks to train whistles in several different pitches. That variation is what stops the joke from wearing out, and it represents a considerable amount of unglamorous work by people who were essentially building a percussion track out of stock effects. There is a genuine irony buried in the timing. The same organization that criticized the episode had, during roughly the same television season, also named SpongeBob SquarePants among the better programs available on cable. The show was simultaneously being held up as an example of what children's television should look like, and cited as evidence of decline, by the same group, within a very short window. The complaint also arrived at a moment when the group had considerable influence over advertisers and regulators, which makes the outcome even more unusual. What is striking in hindsight is what did not happen. Nothing was pulled, nothing was edited. Nickelodeon did not apologize, did not shelve the episode, and did not remove it from rotation. Sailor Mouth continued airing, went out on home video, made it onto streaming platforms, and is today one of the most widely recognized episodes the show ever produced. It regularly appears near the top of fan rankings. The dolphin noise itself escaped the show entirely, and became a piece of general internet shorthand, used by people who have never watched a full episode as a way to censor themselves in text and video. That outcome says something about how the argument over the episode actually resolved. The complaint was that treating a taboo playfully would encourage children to break it. What happened instead is that an entire generation absorbed a very specific and very effective lesson, which is that swearing is something adults do when they hurt themselves, that children who repeat it without understanding it look ridiculous, and that the adults enforcing the rule are usually the worst offenders. That is a more honest picture of how profanity works in a real household than most children's programming has ever attempted. The organization that led the criticism is worth understanding, because it shaped a great deal of what American television looked like in that decade. The Parents Television Council spent the late 1990s and 2000s systematically monitoring broadcast content, publishing reports, counting instances of violence and profanity, and encouraging members to file complaints with regulators and contact advertisers directly. That last part was the real mechanism. A network can ignore a report, but it cannot ignore a sponsor asking uncomfortable questions. Shows across the schedule were altered, delayed, and in some cases canceled during that period, partly because of that pressure. When the group named an episode, networks generally paid attention, which makes what happened with Sailor Mouth even more notable. It was named, it was written up, and nothing was done about it. The most likely reason is that the complaint was hard to turn into a demand. There was nothing to remove. No word was spoken. A network cannot cut a dolphin noise out of an episode without cutting the entire episode, and no advertiser was going to withdraw over a bird call. The episode also sits at the center of a much larger conversation about how much adult material was hiding in the early seasons of the show. Fans who rewatch the first 3 seasons as grown adults consistently report finding jokes they did not register as children, and there are a great many of them. Innuendo built into background signage, jokes about drinking, visual gags that only read as suggestive if you already know what they are referencing. Several of the writers and artists on staff had come from another Nickelodeon series, famous for pushing content boundaries, until the network intervened, and that sensibility carried over. The show was never as innocent as its reputation, and Sailor Mouth is simply the most visible piece of evidence, because it is the one built entirely out of the joke. That reputation has fed a long-running hunt among fans for material that was recorded and never used. The knowledge that the cast improvised actual invented profanity in the booth, and that at least one exchange was written and then cut before broadcast, has convinced a section of the fandom that an uncensored version of the episode exists somewhere in an archive. Tom Kenny has discussed the recording sessions publicly on more than one occasion, which keeps the idea alive. Nothing has ever surfaced. A clip claiming to show an uncensored line spread online at one point, and was traced back to a fan-made edit rather than anything from the production. The episode has effectively become a small piece of lost media, chased by people who understand perfectly well that what they are looking for probably never existed as a finished thing. The episode also became a template. In the years that followed, a string of animated shows aimed at older children began using implied swearing covered by sound effects, mouth movements without audio, or characters cutting each other off. The technique let writers reach the part of the audience that already knew what was being implied, without ever putting anything explicit on screen. Sailor Mouth did not invent that idea, but it demonstrated on a very large stage that it could be done inside a mainstream children's cartoon without the network collapsing. The episode has also aged in a direction nobody expected. Watch today, the thing that stands out is not the swearing, but how carefully constructed the moral of it is. The 2 children learn the word from a wall, not from an adult. They are given a confident and completely wrong explanation by a friend who also does not know. They use it without malice because they have no idea what it means. They are corrected by an adult, who then immediately demonstrates that he is far worse than they are. And the correction ultimately comes from his mother, which places the whole thing inside a chain of family embarrassment, rather than a lecture. That is a more sophisticated piece of writing about how children acquire language than most programs aimed at adults ever manage. The unanswered question has kept the episode alive for over 2 decades. Nobody involved has ever confirmed what the original word on the dumpster was supposed to be, and nobody has confirmed what the other 12 were. Fans have spent years counting syllables, reading lip movements, and analyzing the length of each dolphin chirp trying to work it out. The production has consistently refused to settle it, and the refusal is the correct creative choice, because the joke only works as long as the word stays exactly where it belongs, which is inside the imagination of whoever is watching. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A cartoon making swearing funny is one kind of line to cross. Roughly 9 years later, the same show aired an episode where one character deliberately tormented another for over 2 weeks, and the audience that had defended Sailor Mouth turned on it completely. Section 5. The Suicide Joke. One-Course Meal. By 2010, SpongeBob SquarePants had been on the air for 11 years. It had survived a feature film that many people assumed would be the ending. It had survived the departure of its creator from day-to-day showrunning, and it had settled into a rhythm as one of the most reliably profitable properties in children's entertainment. Season 7 was well underway, and the episodes were arriving at a steady pace. Then one of them landed, and a section of the audience that had defended the show through every previous argument decided it had finally gone somewhere it should not have gone. The episode is called One-Course Meal. It aired, paired with a second segment called Gary in Love, which matters only because the second segment is generally well-liked, and the pairing means the two are permanently attached to each other in listings and on home video. Almost nobody talks about Gary in Love. Everybody talks about the other one. The premise begins in familiar territory. Plankton is once again trying to steal the Krabby Patty formula, and once again failing. Mr. Krabs, in the course of chasing him off, makes a discovery. Plankton is terrified of whales. It is a completely logical fear for a microscopic organism to have, since a whale eating plankton is not a threat, it is a food chain. The moment Mr. Krabs realizes this, the episode stops being a normal rivalry story. Mr. Krabs begins dressing up as his own daughter Pearl, who is a whale, and using the disguise to terrify Plankton. He does not do this once. He does it repeatedly. Over a stretch of time the episode establishes as 16 days. Plankton stops sleeping. He begins having nightmares, in which an enormous version of Pearl devours him, and everyone related to him. He becomes paranoid, exhausted, and visibly unwell. The episode presents all of this as the punchline, rather than the problem. By the final act, Plankton has been broken down completely, and he decides to end his own life. He goes out into the road and lies down in the path of oncoming traffic, and he tells SpongeBob directly what he is planning to do. SpongeBob's response is to accept it casually and walk away. SpongeBob then reports what is happening to Mr. Krabs, and Mr. Krabs laughs. He remarks that Plankton is a mess and finds the whole situation funny. There is a brief attempt at balance late in the episode. SpongeBob does eventually tell Plankton the truth about who has been terrorizing him, and Plankton attempts to turn the tables by exploiting a fear of his own that Mr. Krabs turns out to have. But the retaliation lasts a matter of seconds. Mr. Krabs shrugs it off almost immediately, and the episode ends with him having effectively won. He faces no meaningful consequence for anything he has done. Pearl appears in the episode and is never told that her father has been impersonating her in order to psychologically destroy someone. There is a small mercy in the episode's construction, which is that almost none of what disturbs adult viewers is legible to a young child watching casually. The scenes are staged as slapstick, and the language used is vague enough that the intent passes over most of the intended audience entirely. That does not excuse the writing choice, but it does explain why the episode aired without any organized parental complaint at all. The reaction from the fandom was unlike anything the show had produced before. Previous controversies had come from outside, from parents' groups or religious organizations or news outlets. This one came from inside. The people who were angry were people who had watched the show since childhood, and their complaints were detailed, specific, and relentless. The central objection was structural, rather than squeamish. Very few fans argued that a cartoon can never touch a dark subject. What they argued was that the episode framed a character driving another character to that point as a victory, and then let him keep the victory. Mr. Krabs is presented throughout as the one the audience is supposed to be rooting for. He is the underdog protecting his business from a thief. Under that framing, everything he does is justified, including 16 days of deliberate psychological cruelty aimed at someone who, in this particular episode, had not actually managed to do anything to him. The second objection was about SpongeBob himself. The character had spent a decade as the emotional center of the show, the one who cared about everyone, including the people who did not deserve it. Watching him hear that someone intended to end their life and respond with a cheerful goodbye struck long-time viewers as a fundamental break with who the character had always been. Fans used the phrase character assassination, and they used it about SpongeBob more than about Mr. Krabs, because Mr. Krabs had been drifting toward cruelty for several seasons already, while SpongeBob had not. The third objection was about the relationship between the two rivals. Later material in the franchise had established that Mr. Krabs and Plankton were once close friends who fell out over the restaurant business. Fans pointed out that the episode reads very differently once you know that history, because it stops being a business rivalry and becomes a man systematically destroying someone he used to care about, for entertainment. Petitions began circulating. More than one campaign appeared on public petition platforms asking Nickelodeon to stop airing the episode entirely, and the arguments made in them were surprisingly measured. They pointed out that the subject is not hypothetical, that people watching might be dealing with the same feelings, and that presenting the whole thing as a joke with no consequences sent a message the writers probably had not thought through. Fan encyclopedias covering the series added notes describing the episode as widely deplored and frequently ranked among the worst the show ever made. Review aggregators show it sitting at the bottom of the entire series alongside a small handful of other episodes. Nickelodeon never pulled it. Unlike other episodes that quietly vanished from rotation over the years, one course meal has remained available. It has aired in reruns, it has appeared on home video, and it has been streamable for most of the time since it first went out. The network has never issued a statement about it. The closest thing to an official response has come from members of the crew engaging with angry fans on social media over the years, generally acknowledging that the reaction exists without offering a defense of the episode itself. What makes the episode important in the larger story of the show is that it became a marker. Fans use it as the point where a specific trend became impossible to ignore. Somewhere around the middle seasons, a category of episode had emerged that people eventually started calling torture episodes. The pattern is consistent. One character is selected, usually Squidward or Plankton, occasionally SpongeBob himself, and the entire runtime is spent putting them through escalating misery, while the other characters either fail to notice or actively contribute. There is an episode built around a wound that gets progressively more disgusting until it drives Squidward out of his mind. There is one where SpongeBob's neglect of Gary is played for laughs until it becomes uncomfortable. There is one where SpongeBob is fired and reduced to poverty. There is one where a character is manipulated into repeatedly injuring themselves. There is one built around extracting something from Squidward by making him cry. Individually, any one of these can be defended as dark comedy. Stacked together, they describe a show that had drifted a long way from what it started as. Early SpongeBob was built on optimism running into obstacles. The middle seasons increasingly ran on cruelty, running into more cruelty. One course meal is the episode fans point at because it takes that drift to its furthest point and then treats the outcome as a happy ending. The reaction to this episode also produced something unusual, which is an entire branch of fan culture organized around the show's failures. Dedicated wikis exist purely to catalog the episodes fans consider unwatchable, with detailed breakdowns of what went wrong in each one, arguments about which character was ruined and when, and rankings that get revised as new seasons arrive. These are maintained archives, written by people who have watched every episode multiple times, and can cite specific scenes from memory. The tone across them is closer to grief than to hatred, which tells you something about who is writing them. That level of engagement only happens when an audience feels genuine ownership. Nobody builds a maintained archive documenting the decline of a show they were never attached to. The bitterness in these fan spaces is proportional to how much the original mattered, and it is aimed at very specific things. Mr. Krabs becoming a sociopath rather than a miser. Squidward suffering without any of the dignity his early episodes gave him. SpongeBob shifting from an earnest optimist into something closer to an agent of chaos who causes harm without noticing. Each of those complaints is about a character drifting away from a version the audience had internalized, and each of them can be traced across specific seasons if someone wants to do the work. Fans have done the work. The production side has rarely engaged with any of this directly, and when it has, the engagement has been informal rather than official. Members of the crew have maintained public social media accounts for years and have answered fan questions, corrected rumors, and occasionally pushed back on criticism. There has never been a formal statement from the network acknowledging that any episode went too far, and there is no real reason to expect one. Companies do not issue apologies for episodes that are still generating revenue. There is a fair counter-argument, and it deserves airing. The show had always been willing to go to strange and unsettling places. Some of the most celebrated early episodes are disturbing if you look at them without nostalgia, and several of the episodes fans now hold up as the worst were made while Steven Hillenburg was still involved with the production. The idea that everything was gentle before a certain year and cruel after it does not survive contact with the actual episode list. What changed was less about darkness and more about consequence. Early episodes let characters be terrible and then made sure it cost them something. The later ones increasingly did not. It is also worth being clear about what the episode does and does not represent about the show as a whole. Season 7 contains a large number of episodes that fans rate highly, and the same production team that made this one made those. Television produced at this volume, on this schedule, for this long, will contain misjudgments. What makes this particular misjudgment so visible is that it involves a subject where getting the tone wrong is not a matter of taste. Almost everything else the show has been criticized for is arguable. This one has a very small margin for error, and the episode used all of it and then kept going. The episode also raises a question about who children's television is actually written for. A 4-year-old watching One Course Meal sees a small green character being scared by a big scary thing, and then a funny bit with a road. almost none of what upset adult fans is legible at that age. The people who were angry were people in their 20s, who had grown up with the show and were now watching it with adult eyes, applying adult standards to something that was still, technically, aimed at children. That gap between the audience the show was made for and the audience that had grown up inside it has shaped nearly every argument about the series since. What makes it stranger still is that the show has handled similar material well elsewhere. There are episodes across the run that deal with loneliness, failure, and despair with real care, giving Squidward in particular moments of genuine sadness that land because the writing takes them seriously. The capability was clearly present in the building. That is what makes this one difficult to defend as a simple lapse in judgment. The team could clearly handle heavy material when they wanted to. On this occasion, they chose to treat it as a punchline and gave the last laugh to the character responsible. None of which changes the basic fact that a mainstream children's cartoon built an episode around one character driving another to attempt suicide, played the reaction for laughs, and let the aggressor walk away untouched. 15 years later, it is still the first thing that comes up whenever anyone asks what the worst thing this show ever did was. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Nickelodeon never removed that one. But the network has quietly pulled other episodes off the air, and the reasons behind those decisions have almost nothing to do with what fans thought was wrong with the show. 2 of them disappeared for completely different reasons, and only one ever came back. Section 6. The pulled episodes, Midlife Crustacean, and Quarantined Crab. There is a difference between an episode people hate and an episode that stops existing. Fans can campaign for years against something and watch it stay in rotation regardless. Meanwhile, an episode nobody had complained about can vanish overnight because of a decision made in a room nobody outside the company ever sees. SpongeBob SquarePants has examples of both, and the 2 most famous disappearing acts happened for reasons that had nothing to do with each other. The first is Midlife Crustacean. It comes from Season 3 and first aired on Nickelodeon in 2003, paired with a segment called The Great Snail Race. For 15 years, it was completely unremarkable. It ran in reruns constantly. It went out on home video. It sat inside the run of episodes that most fans consider the strongest stretch the series ever produced. And in a ranking of the show's 100 best episodes published by a major television magazine in 2019, it was placed at number 79. It was not hidden, it was not obscure, and nobody was campaigning against it. The plot follows Mr. Krabs having a crisis about getting old. He overhears SpongeBob and Patrick making plans for the evening, and decides he needs to come along in order to feel young again. What he does not account for is that SpongeBob and Patrick are, by any reasonable measure, deeply strange people whose idea of a wild night out involves activities a small child would find tame. They spend the evening doing a series of harmless and childish things, while Mr. Krabs waits increasingly desperately for something exciting to happen. Then the episode reaches the sequence that eventually removed it from television. SpongeBob and Patrick announce that it is time for a raid, and explain it as something they do regularly. The 3 of them break into a house in order to steal underwear from a woman's bedroom. The prank they are describing was a real thing, a fad among American college students in the middle of the 20th century, that has since been reassessed fairly harshly. The episode ends with the reveal that the house they have broken into belongs to Mr. Krabs' own mother, who catches him and sends him to his childhood bedroom as punishment, which is the actual joke the whole sequence was built to deliver. In 2018, Nickelodeon quietly stopped airing it. There was no announcement. Nobody outside the company appears to have noticed at the time. The reason only became public in 2021, when a completely separate episode was in the news, and journalists began asking questions about the show's back catalog. A Nickelodeon spokesperson confirmed that the episode had been out of rotation since 2018, following an internal standards review in which the company determined that some of the story elements were not appropriate for children. That is an oddly restrained statement for what is, in practice, a permanent ban. It came off the broadcast schedule, and off streaming platforms as well, disappearing from Paramount's own service and from other digital storefronts. For a period, it remained purchasable on a small number of platforms, and it remained present on a physical home video set carrying a 2020 copyright, which meant the episode existed in some formats and not others, depending entirely on which shelf you were looking at. In 2023, it briefly reappeared on streaming, apparently through a technical error rather than a change of policy, and was taken down again quickly. As of now, it is the one episode of the series that has been fully and consistently removed from circulation, with no indication that will change. The fan argument against the decision is not that the sequence is fine. Very few people defend it on its own terms. The argument is about consistency. The early seasons of SpongeBob are full of material that would never be approved today, and a significant amount of it is still airing without any issue. Several members of the show's crew, including Vincent Waller, had previously worked on another Nickelodeon series from the early 1990s that was famous specifically for pushing content limits until the network intervened, and that sensibility carried over into the writing room. Fans point at a long list of jokes across the first 3 seasons that are considerably more adult than anything in the pulled episode, all of which remain freely available. The likely explanation is not that this one gag is uniquely bad, but that it is uniquely central. Most of the questionable material in early SpongeBob is a single line or a 2-second visual that can be cut without damaging the episode. In Midlife Crustacean, the raid is the third act. It cannot be trimmed out, because removing it removes the ending, the punchline, and the entire reason the story exists. An episode that cannot be edited is an episode that has to be either kept whole or dropped entirely, and the company chose to drop it. The second disappearance has a completely different shape. The episode is called Quarantined Crab, and it comes from a much later stretch of the series. The premise is a return to a character the show had used before, a health inspector who arrives at the Krusty Krab looking for problems. This time he finds something serious. A case of what the episode calls the clam flu is detected inside the restaurant, and in response every customer in the building is sealed inside and prevented from leaving. The rest of the episode is what happens to a crowd of people trapped together in a restaurant, while a contagious illness may or may not be among them. The episode was produced and completed before anyone had heard of the events that would make it unairable. When the global pandemic arrived in 2020, an episode about a quarantine inside a restaurant became an awkward object for a children's network to broadcast. Nickelodeon shelved it in the United States. When asked directly, a representative confirmed that the episode centered on a virus storyline and that the decision had been made not to air it out of sensitivity to what was happening in the real world. A separate statement given to a national newspaper framed it slightly differently, saying the episode had never actually been placed on the schedule in the first place. That distinction mattered more than it might seem, because the episode had already aired elsewhere. Nickelodeon's Latin American operation put it out, meaning the episode existed, had been broadcast, and was available to anyone in the world with an internet connection, while simultaneously being described as not scheduled in the United States. Fans noticed the gap immediately, and the story picked up coverage in the trade press in March 2021. The eventual resolution came slowly. As the world moved on and other television shows began openly writing pandemic storylines into their scripts, the argument for keeping the episode buried weakened. It finally aired in the United States on Nickelodeon on April 29, 2022, roughly 2 years after it was originally ready, and it appeared on streaming alongside its partner segment. It did not, however, make it onto the home video release for its season, which is why fans collecting the series on disc still have a gap where it should be. The fan reaction to each removal was also revealing. Almost nobody campaigned to bring back Midlife Crustacean on the grounds that the sequence was defensible. What people objected to was the process, and specifically the fact that a company can quietly delete part of a shared cultural object without telling anyone. The complaint was procedural rather than moral, which is a distinction that gets lost whenever these arguments are summarized as fans being upset about censorship. Placing the two cases side by side is where it gets interesting, because they are opposites in every meaningful way. One episode was pulled because of something the writers chose to put in it. The other was pulled because of something that happened in the real world years after it was made. One was removed permanently after 15 years of untroubled broadcast. The other was withheld before anyone had seen it, and then released once the timing improved. One has never returned, the other did. Both decisions were also made by people who will never explain them publicly, which is worth stating plainly rather than treating as a conspiracy. Standards departments exist. They review material continuously, and their work is internal by design. Together they show two completely different pressures acting on the same library. The first is retroactive standards, which is what happens when a company reviews decades of material against expectations that did not exist when the material was made. That process is going to keep happening, to this show and to every other long-running series, and the results will always look arbitrary from the outside because the reviews are internal and the criteria are never published. The second is contextual sensitivity, which is about timing rather than content. Nothing in Quarantined Crab was ever considered wrong. It simply landed in the wrong year. There is a third category worth mentioning, which is the episodes that get quietly altered rather than removed. Long-running animated series routinely have small edits made to older episodes for syndication, trimming a line here or a frame there, and most viewers never notice. Fans who compare broadcast versions against home video releases have documented differences across the run of the show. None of these edits have generated anything close to the attention the two pulled episodes received, largely because a missing joke is invisible, while a missing episode leaves a hole in the list. It is also worth placing both cases against what was happening across the wider industry during the same period. Between roughly 2018 and 2021, a very large number of long-running series had episodes withdrawn from streaming platforms, and the reasons clustered into a small number of categories. Some involved makeup and costume choices that were considered acceptable when filmed and are not now. Some involved storylines built around subjects that a modern standards department will no longer sign off on. Some involved real-world events that made a plot uncomfortable to watch. Almost none of these removals were announced. The overwhelming pattern was that an episode simply stopped appearing in the list, and viewers found out weeks or months later when somebody went looking for it. That silence is deliberate, and it is not hard to understand. Announcing a removal guarantees a news cycle, gives the episode enormous free publicity, and invites an argument the company cannot win. Removing it quietly means most of the audience never notices, which is exactly what happened with Midlife Crustacean for 3 full years. The only reason anyone found out is that a completely unrelated episode was in the news, and reporters started asking follow-up questions about the rest of the library. There is a third and much quieter category worth mentioning, which is alteration rather than removal. Long-running animated shows routinely have small edits made for syndication, and the changes are usually invisible unless you are comparing versions side by side. A line trimmed for time, a frame adjusted, a background sign redrawn. Fans who collect physical releases and compare them against broadcast versions have documented differences across the run of this show, and none of it has ever generated meaningful attention. A missing joke leaves no evidence. A missing episode leaves a hole in a numbered list, which is why only one of these two practices ever becomes a story. There is a further wrinkle that collectors run into constantly, which is that the different versions of the library do not agree with each other. An episode can be present on a physical release, absent from streaming, available for individual purchase on one storefront, and unavailable on another, all at the same moment. That comes less from policy than from dozens of separate licensing arrangements written at different times by different departments, none of which updates simultaneously when somebody makes a call about content. The practical effect is that the answer to whether an episode still exists depends entirely on where you happen to be looking, and the honest answer for most viewers is that they will never find out either way. What the whole situation exposes is how little control the audience has over the version of a show it grew up with. The episodes people remember are not a fixed object. They exist on servers owned by a company that can decide, at any point and without explanation, that something is no longer appropriate. Most of the time, nobody notices. Occasionally, an episode is popular enough that its absence becomes a story, and then everyone finds out at once that a piece of their childhood was quietly filed away 3 years earlier. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A network deciding what its own audience can watch is one thing. An entire government body sitting down to decide whether a cartoon sponge should be legal inside its borders is something else, and in 2012, that is exactly what happened. Section 7. The government that put a cartoon on trial. Ukraine's Morality Commission. In November 2004, the Ukrainian government created a body with a long and serious-sounding name. In English, it translates roughly to the National Expert Commission of Ukraine on the Protection of Public Morality. It was established while Viktor Yanukovych was serving as prime minister, and its stated job was to evaluate media circulating inside the country and check whether it complied with Ukrainian morality laws. Those laws covered a specific and fairly narrow set of things. Material that incited religious hatred was prohibited. Producing or distributing pornography was prohibited. Promoting alcoholism or smoking was prohibited. On paper, the Commission existed to police those boundaries. In practice, the Commission developed a reputation for a much broader interpretation of its mandate, and over the years it turned its attention toward things that had very little to do with religious hatred or cigarettes. It had already gone after The Simpsons at one point, arguing that the show was unsuitable for Ukrainian viewers. But the moment that made it internationally famous came in August 2012, and it involved a sponge. The chain of events started outside the government. A conservative religious organization in Ukraine, operating under a name that translates as Family Under the Protection of the Holy Virgin, produced a report on children's television. The report was framed as a formal study, complete with expert commentary, and its conclusion was extraordinary. It claimed that a group of popular children's programs, taken together, amounted to a large-scale experiment being conducted on Ukrainian children, and that the purpose of that experiment was to produce criminals and perverts. The list of programs named in the report was long and, from an outside perspective, wildly inconsistent. SpongeBob SquarePants was on it, so were the Teletubbies, so were animated films from Disney, the Shrek movies, South Park, The Simpsons, Family Guy, Futurama, and Pokémon. The report placed a preschool program about 4 brightly colored creatures who live in a hill in the same category as an adult animated comedy known for explicit adult content, on the grounds that both were part of the same coordinated harm. Each show was assigned its own specific accusation. SpongeBob was accused of promoting homosexuality. The report presented this as an established finding rather than an interpretation, and it was this line more than anything else that carried the story around the world. The Teletubbies were accused of something almost stranger, with the report arguing that the program was deliberately designed to create passive, unthinking adults who would sit in front of screens with their mouths open, absorbing whatever they were shown, and that it promoted what the authors described as the psychology of losers. A psychologist quoted in the study described what she considered the behavioral evidence, saying that children between 3 and 5 years old who watched these programs would pull faces and make jokes in front of unfamiliar adults, laugh loudly, and repeat nonsense phrases in a brazen manner. Read plainly, that is a description of a small child being a small child. Presented inside a formal report, it was offered as proof of psychological damage. The report was passed to the Commission, which announced it would review the findings and decide what to do about the programs in question. That announcement was picked up by the Ukrainian press, and from there it jumped almost immediately to international coverage. Major American and British outlets ran the story within days. A business paper covered it. A major news magazine covered it. Wire services picked it up. Within roughly 72 hours, the phrase that had entered global circulation was that Ukraine's morality police were investigating whether SpongeBob was gay. The tone of nearly all the coverage was open mockery, and the mockery had a specific target. Almost every article pointed out that this was not the first time a children's character had been publicly accused of carrying a hidden message about sexuality. Years earlier, a Teletubby had been the subject of an almost identical claim in the United States, largely on the basis that the character carried a bag. Commentators noted that the same argument was now being made about a sponge who lives in a pineapple, wears square trousers, and has a pet snail that meows like a cat. The absurdity did most of the work without anyone having to build an argument against it. What actually happened next is less dramatic than the headlines suggested. No nationwide ban ever came into force. The Commission reviewed, discussed, and generated enormous amounts of international press, but SpongeBob continued to be available to Ukrainian children. The story burned brightly for about a week, and then faded, as these stories usually do. It is also true that nothing about the episode was unique to that country. Similar complaints about the same programs were being made in several places during the same period, generally by organizations with comparable aims and comparable methods. The Commission itself did not last much longer. Its existence had been contested inside Ukraine for years. A presidential decree issued in December 2010 had already moved toward eliminating it, and the body survived in a diminished state after that. Domestic critics argued that the law creating it was dangerously vague, because it required a small group of appointed officials to decide what counted as harm to public morality, with almost nothing to constrain how subjective that judgment could be. The SpongeBob episode became a useful example for exactly that argument, since it demonstrated in public what happens when a body with vague authority is handed a report written by people with a specific agenda. In February 2015, the Ukrainian parliament disbanded the commission entirely. The report's handling of its own evidence is telling. The document did not present a survey, a controlled study, or any measurement of children who had watched the programs against children who had not. It presented assertions from selected experts, descriptions of children behaving in ways children behave anyway, and a conclusion about coordinated intent that no piece of the material supported. Reports of this kind are usually written to be quoted rather than examined, and the conclusion is generally decided before the evidence is assembled. The reason it worked well enough to reach a state commission is that almost nobody in the chain, including most of the journalists who covered it, ever read past the summary. What makes the whole affair worth remembering is the pattern it belongs to, rather than the ban that never arrived. Children's television has been treated as a battlefield for coded messages for as long as children's television has existed, and the accusations follow a consistent shape. A character is identified, a trait is isolated, usually something visual and easily described. That trait is then read as a deliberate signal rather than a design choice. The bag, the color, the hand-holding, the voice. Once the reading exists, it cannot be disproved, because there is no evidence that would satisfy someone who has already decided the message is hidden on purpose. That pattern has a long history, and children's entertainment has been at the center of it repeatedly. In the middle of the 20th century, comic books were the target, with a psychiatrist publishing a book arguing that they were producing juvenile delinquents, followed by congressional hearings and an industry-wide censorship code that reshaped American comics for decades. In the 1980s, the target was a tabletop role-playing game, accused of leading teenagers toward the occult, which produced television specials, parental campaigns, and a great deal of coverage that has aged badly. In the 1990s, the target was popular music, then video games, then a preschool program about 4 brightly colored creatures in a hill. The structure of each of these panics is nearly identical. Something new becomes popular with young people faster than adults can evaluate it. An authority figure identifies a danger, usually one that cannot be measured. Media coverage amplifies the claim, because the claim is dramatic and the rebuttal is boring. And the thing itself carries on being popular, because none of the people actually consuming it recognize the description being offered of what they are doing. What makes the 2012 case slightly different is that it came with the apparatus of a state body attached. A parents' group complaining about a cartoon has no power beyond persuasion. A government commission with statutory authority to evaluate media against morality laws is a different kind of object, even when the specific thing in front of it is a sponge in trousers. That combination of genuine legal authority and completely unserious subject matter is what made the story irresistible to international press, and it is also what made it worth taking seriously as something other than a joke. The other thing the affair demonstrates is scale. SpongeBob SquarePants has been broadcast in an enormous number of countries and dubbed into a very long list of languages. It is one of a small handful of pieces of American entertainment that reaches almost everywhere. That reach means the show does not get to choose which cultural arguments it participates in. It arrives in every country simultaneously and becomes available as a symbol for whatever fight happens to be running there. In one country, that means a fight about children's attention spans. In another, it means a fight about family structure. In another, it means a fight about foreign cultural influence arriving through a television set. The specific accusation leveled at the show also says more about the accusers than about the material. Nothing in any episode addresses the subject in question. What the report was actually reacting to was a set of visual and behavioral cues, a character who is affectionate with his friends, physically expressive, and uninterested in acting tough. Reading those traits as a coded message requires a prior belief that such traits are themselves a message, which is a belief the report brought with it rather than one the cartoon supplied. Nickelodeon, for its part, said essentially nothing. There is no record of the company issuing a serious response to the Ukrainian report, and that silence was almost certainly the correct commercial decision. Engaging would have extended the story by weeks, and given the claims a level of legitimacy that ignoring them denied. The company had learned this lesson in 2005 during the argument in the United States, where every response from every party involved simply generated another news cycle. By 2012, the strategy was to let it pass. There is a final detail that gives the whole episode a sharper edge in hindsight. The commission was disbanded, partly because of concerns about arbitrary state power over what people are allowed to see, and that concern was raised by Ukrainians about their own government. The story that made the commission internationally famous was a comedy story about a cartoon. The reason the commission was eventually dismantled was not comedic at all. A body with the authority to decide what counts as moral, staffed by appointees, working from reports submitted by advocacy groups, is a serious thing regardless of how ridiculous the specific case in front of it happens to be. The sponge was the joke. The mechanism was not. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every attack on the show came from people with a political point to make. In 2011, a team of research psychologists ran an experiment on 60 small children, published the results in a medical journal, and produced the single most damaging headline the show has ever had to answer for. Section 8, 9 minutes, the study that put SpongeBob in a medical journal. On September 12, 2011, the journal Pediatrics published a paper by two researchers from the psychology department at the University of Virginia. The lead author was Angeline Lillard, working with Jennifer Peterson. The paper was short, the experiment was simple, and the finding was blunt. 9 minutes of watching a fast-paced fantastical cartoon produced immediate negative effects on the executive function of 4-year-olds. Executive function is a term that gets thrown around loosely, so it is worth explaining properly. It refers to the set of mental abilities that let a person hold a goal in mind and work toward it. Paying attention, solving a problem, remembering instructions for long enough to follow them, waiting for something instead of grabbing it immediately. These are the abilities that let a child sit through a lesson, and they develop rapidly during the preschool years. Lillard chose 4-year-olds specifically because that age sits in the middle of the window where those abilities are developing fastest, which makes any effect easier to detect. The experiment used 60 children, randomly divided into 3 groups of 20. One group spent 9 minutes drawing freely with markers and crayons. One group spent 9 minutes watching Caillou, a slower-paced educational program from public television about an ordinary preschool-aged boy. The third group spent 9 minutes watching SpongeBob SquarePants. Immediately after, every child completed 4 tasks designed to measure the abilities described above. The results were not subtle. The children who had watched the fast-paced cartoon performed significantly worse than either of the other 2 groups across the board. On the problem-solving measures, roughly 70% of the children who had been drawing passed. Around 35% of the children who had watched the slower program passed. Only about 15% of the children who had watched the faster cartoon passed. On average, the fast cartoon group scored around 12 points lower than the other 2 groups, which were roughly equal to each other. The impulse control measure produced the detail that ended up in most of the news coverage, because it is the easiest one to picture. A researcher placed a snack in front of each child and told them they could eat it, but that if they waited until the researcher returned, they would get something better. Then the researcher left the room. The children who had watched the slower program or spent the time drawing waited an average of about 4 minutes. The children who had watched the fast cartoon waited about 2.5 minutes. The researchers had a specific reason for choosing the 2 programs they used, and it comes down to a measurement of pace. SpongeBob SquarePants changes scenes roughly every 11 seconds. Caillou changes scenes roughly every 30 seconds, or about twice a minute. That difference is enormous. Over 9 minutes, one program presents a child with something close to 50 separate scene changes, while the other presents around 18. The hypothesis being tested was that the constant switching, combined with events that could not happen in the real world, places demands on a young brain that leave it temporarily depleted. The researchers were careful about how far they took that conclusion, and their caution matters, because almost none of it survived contact with the press. They said explicitly that they could not determine which specific feature was responsible. It might be the pacing, it might be the fantastical content, it might be the combination of the 2. They also said the effects observed were immediate and short-term, and that the study said nothing about long-term consequences. They noted that the children in the sample were mostly white and from middle-class or wealthy families, which limits how far the findings can be generalized. And they said that results from 4-year-olds cannot be assumed to apply to children of other ages. Lillard also said, repeatedly and directly, that SpongeBob should not be singled out. She had found similar effects with other fast-paced programs, and her point was about a category of television rather than one show. Her practical advice was equally general. She suggested parents avoid putting fast-paced programming on immediately before situations where children would be expected to concentrate, using the example of watching something in the car on the way to school. That is a modest, reasonable recommendation. The paper was accompanied in the same issue by commentary from a child development specialist at a children's hospital, who framed the finding in a single memorable line. What children watch matters, not simply how much they watch. That framing was significant because most of the research up to that point had focused on total screen time, treating an hour of television as an hour of television regardless of content. This study argued that the internal structure of a program might matter more than the clock. None of the caution mattered once the story reached the news. The paper itself never names the show in its main description, referring instead to a very popular fantastical cartoon about an animated sponge that lives under the sea. Every single outlet that covered it named the show in the headline. Within 24 hours, the story was everywhere, and the framing was uniform. A cartoon was making children worse at thinking. Wire services carried it. National broadcasters carried it. Newspapers ran it on the front of their health sections. The phrase that stuck was that 9 minutes of SpongeBob damages a child's attention span, which is a considerably stronger claim than anything the paper actually made. The 4 tasks used in the experiment are standard instruments in developmental psychology and have been used for decades, which is part of why the finding was taken seriously despite the small sample. Nickelodeon responded quickly and aggressively, which was itself a departure from how the company had handled previous controversies. A network spokesperson argued that the methodology was questionable, pointing out that 60 children from a narrow demographic background, watching 9 minutes of programming they were not the intended audience for, could not possibly support conclusions parents should rely on. The company's central objection was about age. SpongeBob SquarePants, the network said, is written for children aged 6 to 11. It is not made for 4-year-olds, and never has been. A senior executive from the company's consumer research division appeared on a national news program to make the same argument in more detail, saying she could not follow the logic of comparing a program designed to entertain older children against a program designed to educate very young ones, and treating the difference in outcomes as meaningful. That is a strong point, and it was largely ignored. It is also not a complete defense, because the obvious response is that 4-year-olds watch it anyway, in enormous numbers, and a program's stated target audience has very little to do with who is actually sitting in front of the television. Both things are true at once, which is why the argument never resolved. In the years since, the study has had a complicated afterlife. It remains widely cited and is regularly referenced in discussions about media and child development. It also attracted the standard criticisms that follow any small experimental study that produces a headline finding. 60 participants is a small sample. The effects measured were short-term and were not tracked to see how long they lasted. Attempts to build on the finding have produced mixed results, with some later work supporting the general idea that pacing affects young children, and other work failing to reproduce the specific effect. That pattern is normal in psychology. One experiment is one experiment. The 9-minute figure did a great deal of the work in the coverage, and it is worth understanding why it was chosen. 9 minutes is roughly the length of a single segment of the show, which means the researchers were exposing children to one complete story rather than an arbitrary slice. That is a sensible design decision. It also produced a headline number small enough to sound alarming, because the implicit message became that a single ordinary viewing session was enough to cause measurable harm. The design choice and the headline were the same fact seen from 2 directions. What is beyond dispute is the study's cultural impact. For a generation of parents, this single paper became the reason a specific cartoon was treated as suspect. It gets referenced in parenting forums, in school newsletters, and in conversations between adults who have never read the paper and could not name the researchers. The finding was compressed into a rule of thumb, and the rule of thumb outlived every caveat attached to it. There is also a fairness question in how the coverage landed. The paper describes its stimulus generically, without naming the program in its main text, precisely because the researchers were making a point about a category rather than a brand. The lead author repeated that point in interview after interview and got nowhere with it. Every headline named the show, because the show was the only element of the story that guaranteed a reader would click. A study about pacing effects in preschool media is a specialist finding. A study about a famous cartoon is a national story. The researchers did the work carefully, and then watched the framing get taken out of their hands within a single news cycle, which is an experience a very large number of scientists would recognize. The reason it spread so effectively is that it told people something they already believed. By 2011, there was widespread anxiety about children, screens, and shortening attention spans, and there was a widespread sense that television had become faster and louder than it used to be. The study arrived carrying scientific authority and confirmed the suspicion. It also had a villain who was already famous, which is the one thing every science story needs and almost never has. A paper about pacing effects in preschool media would have been read by specialists. A paper about SpongeBob was read by everyone. The paper also has to be understood as part of a longer research conversation rather than as a single dramatic finding. For years before it appeared, researchers had been publishing work connecting television exposure in early childhood with later attention difficulties, and most of that work measured hours rather than content. The problem with that approach is that hours are easy to count and almost impossible to interpret, because a household where a child watches 4 hours a day differs from a household where a child watches 30 minutes in dozens of ways that have nothing to do with television. Studies built on total viewing time struggle to separate the screen from everything else in the room. What the 2011 experiment did differently was randomize. Children were assigned to conditions rather than observed in their own homes, which removes most of the background differences and allows a much cleaner comparison. That design strength is real, and it is why the study is still cited. The trade-off is that a randomized experiment can only measure what happens in the next few minutes. It cannot tell you anything about what happens over years, and the authors said so plainly. The criticisms that followed were the standard ones. 60 participants divided into 3 groups leaves 20 children per condition, which is a small number for detecting anything subtle. The measures used are sensitive to mood and fatigue, as well as to attention. And the design cannot separate pacing from content, since the fast program was also the fantastical one, and the slow program was also the realistic one. Later work attempting to isolate those factors has produced mixed results, with some studies supporting the general pattern and others failing to find the same effect. That is what the process looks like when it is working properly. The most useful thing the study did was shift the question. Before it, the debate was almost entirely about how long children spent in front of a screen. After it, the debate increasingly included what was on the screen and how it was constructed. That shift has held, and modern guidance for parents tends to talk about content and pacing rather than issuing a flat hourly limit. There is one more layer worth sitting with. The pacing the study measured is the deliberate result of a creative approach. SpongeBob was built by animators who wanted every second to carry a joke, who came out of a tradition of rapid visual comedy, and who treated dead air as failure. The 11-second scene change is craft, executed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The study took a genuine artistic achievement and measured it as a hazard, and both of those descriptions of the same thing are defensible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Real researchers publishing real findings is one way a cartoon ends up somewhere dark. Another way involves an anonymous post on a message board in 2010, an episode that never existed, and a story so effective that people still search for footage of it more than 15 years later. Section 9. The episode that never existed. Squidward's suicide, Red Mist, and the lost tape myths. On April 6, 2010, an anonymous user posted a story to the paranormal board of an image board called 7chan. The story was written in the first person and presented as a true account. The narrator claimed to have worked as an unpaid intern at Nickelodeon Studios in 2005 while completing an animation degree, and said that part of the job involved sitting in on early reviews of episodes before they went out. According to the story, the production team gathered to watch what was supposed to be the premiere episode of the 4th season. What played instead was something else. The narrator describes the episode beginning normally, with Squidward preparing for a concert and being interrupted repeatedly by SpongeBob and Patrick, and then degrading into something that should not have been in the file at all. Sound design that nobody had approved. Imagery that had not been animated by anyone in the room. The narrator describes the lead animator stepping the footage forward frame by frame and finding photographic material spliced between the drawn frames. The story ends without an explanation, and the narrator says up front that there is not one. That post is the origin of what is now one of the most widely known internet horror stories ever written. It circulated first under the title Squidward's Suicide, and it belongs to a genre that was exploding in popularity at exactly that moment. These stories are usually called creepypasta, and the specific subgenre this one belongs to is the lost episode story. The formula is consistent. Take a piece of children's entertainment that a very large number of people remember warmly. Claim that a version of it exists which was never meant to be seen. Describe that version in enough clinical detail to sound like a report rather than a story. Never resolve it. A second version appeared a few months later, in August 2010, written by a different person on a fan wiki. That version carried the title Red Mist and changed several details, adding a supposedly identifiable culprit in the form of an animator who was arrested and prosecuted, along with claims about people who had been harmed by watching the footage. The two versions have been confused with each other ever since, and a great many people who repeat the story assume the second one came first. It did not. The original post predates it by 4 months. In February 2013, a user on a discussion forum posted an account identifying themselves as the author of the original story, effectively confirming what most readers had already concluded, which is that a person sat down in 2010 and wrote a piece of fiction. None of that stopped it. If anything, the confirmation is less well known than the story it debunks. The tale kept spreading through reaction videos, dramatic readings, animated recreations, and short films, many of which attracted audiences in the millions. Fan artists produced a distinctive image of Squidward, with bloodshot, oversized, photographically detailed eyes, and that image escaped the story entirely. Starting around July 2019, it became attached to a completely unrelated joke format circulating on social media, which meant that an enormous number of people who had never read a word of the original story recognized the picture instantly. The story also arrived at a moment when the show itself was in a difficult place, with its longtime audience. The seasons being produced around 2010 are the same ones fans were beginning to describe as a decline, and the same year produced the most reviled episode in the series. A horror story about the show becoming something ugly and unrecognizable landed in a fandom that was already, in a much milder and more literal sense, arguing about exactly that. It is unlikely the author planned that resonance. It almost certainly helped the story travel. The debunking, for anyone who wants it, is not complicated. The claims fall apart at the level of basic production reality. Animated television is not assembled the way the story describes, and finished episodes do not arrive at a review screening containing material nobody involved has seen. The Season 4 premiere of SpongeBob SquarePants is a matter of public record, and is an ordinary episode that anyone can watch. The Nickelodeon facility the narrator claims to have interned at was in the process of shutting down around the period described. And every version of the story leans on a device that appears in essentially every lost episode tale ever written, which is the claim that the animation contained realistically rendered eyes, a detail that does not describe how cell animation or digital animation actually works. The confirmation from the original author is also, in its own way, a good illustration of how little debunking accomplishes once a story has escaped. It has been publicly available for over a decade and remains almost entirely unknown compared to the story it disproves. The interesting question is why this particular show attracted it so powerfully. The answer is that the genre depends entirely on contrast, and SpongeBob provides more contrast than almost anything else available. The show is bright, safe, and enormously familiar. Millions of people can picture the characters, the town, the music, and the general emotional temperature without any effort. That shared familiarity is the raw material the story works with. A horror story about an obscure program has no leverage because the reader has nothing to lose. A horror story about a program someone watched every day after school for 6 years has enormous leverage because it threatens something the reader is already carrying around. The timing of 2010 was not accidental either. That year sits almost exactly at the point where a specific set of conditions lined up. Anonymous image boards had matured into places where fiction and testimony were indistinguishable by design, since nobody had a name attached to anything they posted. Video hosting had become universal, which meant a written story could be turned into footage within days by anyone with editing software. And the first generation who had grown up entirely inside internet culture were now old enough to be writing rather than only reading. The lost episode genre exploded across roughly 18 months, attaching itself to nearly every major children's property in existence, and the versions that survived were the ones written about shows with the widest possible recognition. The most famous companion piece involves a black and white cartoon mouse and a supposedly unreleased short from the 1930s, described in almost identical language. That story predates this one and clearly influenced it, down to the structure of a horrified group of professionals watching something they were never meant to see. The similarity is not evidence of anything except that these stories are written to a formula, and that the formula works. What makes them effective is a specific psychological trick. The stories are never written from the perspective of a victim. They are written from the perspective of a witness, usually someone in a mundane job with no particular stake in what they are describing. The narrator is bored, professional, and slightly embarrassed to be telling you. That framing removes the sense that anyone is trying to frighten you, which is precisely what makes it frightening. A story that announces itself as horror can be resisted. A story that presents itself as an awkward memory somebody has been sitting on for years slips past that defense entirely. The other structural trick is the refusal to explain. The original post opens by warning the reader there is no answer at the end, and then delivers exactly that. Most amateur horror writing fails because it explains too much. This one succeeded because it withheld everything, leaving the reader to build the missing footage themselves, which is always more effective than anything an author could have described. The lost episode myth is not the only piece of folklore attached to the show. There is a whole ecosystem of claims that have circulated for years, and most of them share the same structure, which is a small kernel of something real, wrapped in a large amount of invention. One of the most persistent involves the Krabby Patty. The show has never revealed what the secret formula contains, and it has built dozens of episodes around protecting that secret. Fans filled the gap with a theory that the patties contain crab meat, which would mean the restaurant's owner has spent his entire career serving his own species to customers. Supporters point to the fact that the show refuses to answer the question, that Mr. Krabs reacts with disproportionate panic whenever the formula is threatened, and that the series has occasionally shown him behaving strangely around anything crab-related. The counter-argument is that a children's cartoon, which has repeatedly shown the formula as a written recipe on a piece of paper, is not hiding a cannibalism plot, and that the whole point of a secret formula is that it works better unrevealed. The show has flirted with the joke often enough to keep the theory alive, without ever committing to it. Another long-running argument is far more mundane and somehow more heated. It concerns whether SpongeBob is a sea sponge or a kitchen sponge. The answer, from a design standpoint, is not really in dispute. He is a sea sponge. His creator was a marine biologist whose entire reason for making the show was to introduce children to real tide pool life, and the earliest version of the character came out of an educational comic about intertidal creatures. The confusion exists because of his shape. Real sea sponges are irregular and lumpy, and the character is a perfect rectangle with holes in it, which is a drawing of a cleaning product. That was a deliberate choice made, because a rectangle is funnier and reads more clearly on screen than an accurate sponge would. The show itself has leaned into the ambiguity for jokes on more than one occasion, which is why the argument never dies. Then there are the theories that operate at the level of the whole series, rather than any single detail. Some fans have argued that the town functions as an afterlife of some kind. Others have argued that the entire show takes place inside someone's imagination. These are the least interesting of the lot, mostly because they can be applied to any fictional setting and explain nothing specific about this one. There is one more category of myth worth mentioning, which is the claim that the show predicted something. Every long-running series eventually accumulates these, because a program with hundreds of episodes containing thousands of background gags will inevitably produce images that resemble later real events. Screenshots get circulated with confident captions, dates get attached that do not match the actual broadcast, and the claim spreads faster than anyone can check it. The underlying mechanism is simply volume. Produce enough material over enough years, and coincidence becomes statistically guaranteed, which is considerably less interesting than the alternative explanation, and therefore considerably less likely to be shared. What holds all of it together is a single fact about the show's position in culture. SpongeBob SquarePants has been running continuously since 1999. There are adults with mortgages who cannot remember a time before it existed. When something occupies that much shared mental space for that long, it stops being a television program and becomes common ground, and people build things on common ground. Some of what gets built is analysis, some of it is comedy, and some of it is a story posted anonymously at 4 a.m. about an episode that was never made, which then outlives most of the actual episodes in the public memory. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Stories written by strangers on the internet cannot hurt the people who made the show. The last controversy could, because it started with a death, and it involved the question of what a company is allowed to do with something after the person who created it is no longer around to object. Section 10. After Hillenburg, the spin-off fight. Steven Hillenburg announced in March 2017 that he had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a progressive disease that gradually destroys the nerve cells controlling movement. He said at the time that he intended to keep working on the show for as long as he was able. He died on November 26, 2018. He had also, by that point, stepped back into the show for a second film and remained involved with the series in the years afterward, which meant his death was not the departure of a distant founder. He was a working part of the production when it happened. The reaction was larger than anyone at Nickelodeon appears to have anticipated. Tributes came from voice actors, animators, competitors, musicians, and an enormous number of ordinary people who had never met him and had no professional connection to the show. Part of that was simple affection for what he had made. Part of it was the story of how he made it, because his path into animation was strange. He had trained as a marine biologist. He had worked at an ocean education center teaching schoolchildren about tide pools. He had drawn an illustrated comic about intertidal creatures as a teaching aid, with a talking sponge acting as the guide. Only after all of that did he go back to school to study animation, work his way into television, and pitch a show about the thing he had actually cared about since the beginning. The first public flashpoint after his death came only a few months later, at the Super Bowl in February 2019. Fans had organized around a specific request. There is a well-remembered sequence in the show in which the characters perform a song called Sweet Victory in front of a stadium crowd, and fans wanted that sequence acknowledged during the halftime show as a tribute. A petition gathered well over 1 million signatures. The campaign received enormous coverage in the weeks leading up to the game. What happened on the night satisfied almost nobody. A brief clip from the show appeared on the stadium screens, running for a matter of seconds, before the broadcast moved directly into the scheduled performance. Fans who had spent weeks campaigning felt that a tribute measured in seconds, used as a lead-in to something else, was worse than no tribute at all. The reaction online was immediate and negative, and it set the emotional tone for everything that followed. A significant portion of the audience had arrived at the conclusion that the company holding the rights saw the creator's death primarily as a marketing opportunity. That suspicion was waning when the spin-off announcements arrived. Roughly 6 months after Hillenburg's death, Nickelodeon confirmed a new series called Camp Coral. It was a prequel, animated in computer-generated three-dimensional animation rather than the traditional style of the original, and it followed younger versions of the familiar characters attending a summer camp. It premiered on Paramount's streaming service on March 4, 2021, and ran until July 10, 2024. The response from the existing fan base was hostile, in a way that had very little to do with the actual content of the show, because at the point of the announcement, nobody had seen any of it. The objection was about permission. A widely repeated claim held that Hillenburg had never wanted spin-offs, that he had said so publicly, and that the company had waited until he could no longer object before proceeding. A fan started a petition asking Nickelodeon to cancel the project outright, arguing that the timing amounted to using a man's death to extract more value from his work. That petition attracted substantial support, and the sentiment behind it spread far beyond the people who signed it. A second spin-off was announced in August 2020, This one built around Patrick Starr hosting a variety show from his family home. It was developed by a group of people who had worked on the original series for years, including Vincent Waller, Mark Ceccarelli, Mr. Lawrence, Luke Brookshire, Kaz, and Andrew Goodman. It premiered in 2021 and was renewed for a second season of 26 episodes in 2022, at a point when the first season was only halfway through its run. Commercially, both projects were performing well enough for the company to keep expanding. The claim at the center of the backlash turned out to be more complicated than the version that spread online. There is a real basis for it. In an interview given years before his diagnosis, Hillenburg expressed doubt about the idea of spinning the show off, saying he did not see the potential in it, and he had made comments over the years suggesting there were directions he would not want the property taken in. Those statements are genuine, and they are on the record. What complicates it is what people who worked alongside him have said since. Vincent Waller, a longtime producer on the series, stated publicly that Hillenburg had been aware of both spin-off concepts during their early stages and had signed off on the direction the staff were taking. Nickelodeon's head of animation offered a similar account, explaining that Hillenburg received a creator credit on the prequel because the show was about friendship and told the story of how the characters originally met, which was framed as consistent with what he cared about. Members of staff confirmed he was alive while the first spin-off was in production, though he died before the first episode was finished. Waller has been open about why that clarification came out when it did, which is that the backlash had reached a point where correcting the record seemed necessary. That timing produced its own suspicion, since a defense that arrives 3 years after the accusation is always going to be received badly by people who have already made up their minds. There is no clean resolution available here, and pretending otherwise would be dishonest. A man being consulted about a project while living with a terminal neurological illness is not the same as a man enthusiastically greenlighting it in good health, and people can reasonably disagree about how much weight his approval should carry under those circumstances. It is also true that creators change their minds, and that a statement made in one interview a decade earlier is not a binding legal instruction. Both of those things can be held at once. To understand why the reaction was so intense, it helps to look at what had already happened to the franchise before any of this. The first feature film arrived in 2004, and was built by Hillenburg and his original team as an ending. The plan was that the movie would close the story out. Nickelodeon wanted more episodes. Hillenburg stepped back from running the series day to day, and the show continued without him for years while he worked on other projects. He returned for a second film in 2015, and was involved again in the years after that. So by the time of his death, the audience had already lived through one cycle of the property continuing past the point its creator wanted to stop, and a substantial part of the fan base had spent a decade arguing that the show had never fully recovered from it. Alongside the films, the property had expanded in almost every direction available. There were video games across every platform. There was a stage musical that opened on Broadway and picked up 12 Tony nominations, which is a striking outcome for a show about a talking sponge, and one of the few adaptations in the franchise that critics were nearly unanimous about. There were theme park attractions, an endless merchandise line, and a third film that was completed for a theatrical release and then diverted to streaming when cinemas closed in 2020, which annoyed a different set of fans for entirely different reasons. That history matters because it means the spin-off announcements did not land on a neutral audience. They landed on people who had already watched the property expand repeatedly, who had already argued about whether the expansions were any good, and who had just lost the one person whose involvement they treated as a guarantee of quality. The anger was partly about the spin-offs, and partly about everything that had come before them, arriving at the worst possible moment. There is also a practical detail that gets lost in the argument, which is how animation studios actually work. A production the size of this one employs hundreds of people across writing, storyboarding, design, animation, editing, and sound, and most of them are on contracts tied to whatever the studio is currently making. When a long-running series slows down, those jobs disappear unless something else is commissioned to absorb them. Spin-offs keep crews together. That is not a defense of any particular creative decision, but it is part of why studios greenlight them, and it rarely gets mentioned by anyone arguing about legacy. The wider argument underneath the spin-off fight is about ownership, and it is one that will keep recurring across the entire entertainment industry. Legally, the situation is unambiguous. Nickelodeon owns the property, has always owned the property, and is entitled to make whatever it likes with it. Emotionally, a very large number of people feel a different kind of ownership, built out of 2 decades of watching, and they treat decisions about the franchise as decisions about something that belongs partly to them. Those two forms of ownership do not have a mechanism for negotiating with each other, so what happens instead is petitions, angry reviews, and long arguments in comment sections. It is also true that the show has outlasted almost every prediction made about it. It was expected to end after 3 seasons, then after the first film, then after its creator stepped back, then after his death. It has survived all of those, and continues producing new episodes, which places it among the longest-running American animated series ever made. Whatever anyone thinks of the later material, the endurance itself is remarkable, and a fair amount of the anger directed at the franchise is really frustration that something people loved has refused to stop long enough to be remembered fondly. There is also the plain question of quality, which tends to get lost inside the argument about ethics. Critical reception to the prequel was mixed at best, with reviewers describing the comedy as thinner and less surprising than the original, and noting that a show about characters meeting for the first time struggles when only one of them had a defined backstory worth exploring. Some fans have come around on both spin-offs over time, treating them as harmless additions aimed at a younger audience rather than replacements for anything. Others never will. One thing that rarely gets said in these arguments is that the people making the spin-offs were not outsiders. The team behind the second one had, between them, decades of work on the original series as writers, storyboard artists, producers, and in one case the voice of a main character since the first season. They were the crew who had kept the show running for years, doing what animation crews do when a network commissions more work, which is take the job. Directing anger about a corporate decision at the individual artists carrying it out has been a consistent feature of this fandom, and it has generally been misdirected. Taken together with everything else, the spin-off fight closes out the story in a way that says something about all of it. Every controversy attached to this show has ultimately been an argument between people who each believed they understood what it was for. Religious groups thought it was a message. Government commissions thought it was an influence. Researchers thought it was a stimulus. Anonymous writers thought it was a surface to write horror onto. Fans thought it was a friend, and the company that owns it has always known exactly what it is, which is an asset with an extraordinarily long life expectancy. What remains unresolved, and probably always will be, is whether any of the controversies collected here actually changed the show. The honest answer is that almost none of them did. One episode was removed, everything else carried on exactly as before, which is its own kind of answer about how much noise a piece of entertainment can absorb without altering course. The man who started it wanted to teach children about tide pools. Almost everything that has happened since has been other people deciding what the thing he made really meant, usually while he was not in the room, and eventually while he was not anywhere at all. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.